Well, thank you everyone for coming to our lecture today, which is the first lecture of the Transnational Asia Speaker Series this academic year. Through the generosity of Ting Chung and Wei Feng Chao Foundation, and with the support of faculty and staff, the Chao Center for Asian Studies hosts several distinguished scholars annually for guest lectures that are free and open to the public. So we have all of us here and many people on the Zoom joining as well. And before we get started, I would like to thank Jay Law and Hwang Matos for taking care of everything, setting up the logistics so that we could get here smoothly. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Susan Hwang, from the Department of East Asian Languages and Culture Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Susan Hwang specializes in Korean literature and cultural studies, and she focuses on cultures of protest in modern Korea, intellectual history of East Asia, the relationship between aesthetics and politics, theories of world literature, and translation. She's published scholarly articles, translations, and reviews in such venues as the Journal of Korean Studies, ASLEA, Journal of Korean Literature and Culture, Korean Studies, the Routledge Handbook of Modern Korean Literature, and Inter-Asian Cultural Studies. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan, and before joining UC Santa Barbara, she taught in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. So her talk today is based on her book manuscript, which is titled Uncaged Songs, Culture and Politics of Protest Music in South Korea. It's a cultural history of South Korea's song movement, and that situates the movement within both revolutionary and post-revolutionary moments in the country's path toward democracy on the one hand, and within transnational context of circulation on the other. Drawing insights from performance studies, Uncaged Songs demonstrates how the act of collective singing was highly instrumental in consolidating anti-authoritarian resistance into revolutionary action. And we're going to get some sense of that in today's lecture, which incorporates, among other things, 4 songs, I think, from this repertoire. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hwang.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Can people in the room hear me okay? Yeah, back there, it's good, thank you. So, thank you first to Jaemin for inviting me and for the very kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Department of Transnational Asian Studies and Chao Center for this opportunity to share my work at Rice, and to Julie Law for organizing this visit. And also thanks to everyone who's here today in the room and joining in through Zoom as well. So in my talk today, I'd like to engage in a brief overview of my book, Uncaged Songs. And by Uncaged, I'm actually referencing one of my personal heroes, Harry Belafonte, whose very famous quote goes that you can cage the singer, but not the song. So that's where the inspiration stems from for that. So I look at how and why songs as powerful affective conduits became an important part of fostering and shaping the minjung, which is in Korean, populace or the people, minjung-oriented student activism at the height of the democratization movement in South Korea. The student activism, which grew increasingly systematized and organized in turn, played an indispensable role in actively producing and proliferating songs that represented the ideals and values of the minjung movement at large. The inspiration for the moral energy of the minjung movement were drawn from a diverse range of sources, not the least of which included folk songs of foreign origins, but also local origins, broadly referred to as minyo in Korean. Valorized as a category of the people, folk in Korean context would perpetually position itself in contention with the state-designed notion of tradition and merge with the politicized category of minjung, which would come to be articulated as the agent of history and hence the rightful owners of newfound society. The diversity in songs and the moral authority vested in the songs would shift in ways that coincided with major inflection points of the student movement. The consolidation of the student movement and the shifting aesthetics, politics, and function of the songs sung by the movement subjects, the students, that is, went hand in hand with the proliferation of the minjung discourse and later the disavowal of that discourse. So examining the topography of protest music in authoritarian South Korea necessitates articulating some of the major inflection points of the student movement itself. In existing scholarship, the 1980s movement is by and large understood as a continuity of the 1970s resistance to authoritarian regime, and as culminating in July 1987 at the gathering of a crowd millions strong at the funeral procession of the student protester Lee Han-yeol, whose death from police violence occurred shortly after the formal announcement of the transition to direct presidential election. This is often perceived as a crowning victory for the democratization movement. After that watershed year, the narrative of modern Korean history quickly moves to the 1988 Seoul Olympics, with the accompanying shift in keyword from democratization to globalization. But from such a perspective, we'd be hard-pressed to explain one of the most puzzling facts about the 1980s student movement in Korea, namely that some of its most intense and violent episodes occurred after and not before 1987. I argue that the decade must be conceptualized as the long 1980s, which extends past the hard end of 1987 and into the 1990s, and that the 1980s movement and how it structured the campus culture must be understood as showing three distinct paradigm shifts from the 1970s. These paradigm shifts are: one, the transition of the movement from underground to overground activism; two, the shift from crippled resistance to organized revolution; and three, the rearticulation of minjung from the oppressed masses to privileged agent of history. Accordingly, I contend that it is through the songs, which were a vital component of a campus culture, wherein song was implicated as both artifact and event, that we're able to see these points of inflection manifest in a very clear way. So given the topic of this talk, I think it's only fitting to start by asking you to listen to a song with me, a song that often signaled the beginning of a rally.
흔들리지 않게 우리 당연해 흔들리지 않게 우리 당연해 물가에 심어진 나무같이 흔들리지 않게 흔들리지 않게 흔들리지 않게 물가에 심어진 나무같이 흔들리지 않게 와서 모여 함께 하나.
So the use of this song at the start of a rally probably had to do with both its jamboree-esque vibe and the lines, come together now, we shall become one, or 와서 모여 함께 하나가 되자. If the repeated line, like a tree planted by the water, or 물가에 심어진 나무같이, strikes you as biblical, you are not mistaken. According to David Spenner, who wrote an entire book just on this song, the song originated as We Shall Not Be Moved and was first included in Edward Buckner's Spiritual Triumphs Old and New, published in 1927. As an African-American spiritual, We Shall Not Be Moved belongs to a body of thousands of songs created by Africans trafficked into slavery in North America, where they encountered not only the horrors of racist exploitation, but also the powerful messages of liberation and redemption, paradoxically embedded in their white masters' Protestant Christianity. Introduced to Southern Tenant Farmers Union in the 1930s, freedom singers would also sing the song during the March on Washington in 1963, followed by the folk music greats Pete Seeger and Joan Baez. The Spanish version by Joan Baez made its way to Latin America, where it became part of the Nueva Canción movement, the movement that renewed traditional Latin American folk music. So let me play a short clip from the 1970 recording by a Chilean band named Tiempo Nuevo.
No, no, no nos moverán. No, no, no nos moverán. Y el que no crea que haga la prueba, no nos moverán. No, no, no.
So if, as the famous slogan of the Nueva Canción movement declares that there can be no revolution without songs, the 1980s in South Korea presents a fascinating example for the ways in which songs were both born of and guided the struggles for liberation and self-determination. I begin that story in 1975. In the 1970s, the authoritarian regime under Park Chung-hee exerted totalizing control through pervasive censorship and surveillance. One place deemed particularly prone to subversive action was the college campus, and the manifestation of youth culture embraced by the students. By and large, student protesters during the Park regime were part of the underground networks created by Christian youths and laborers. After the announcement of the Presidential Emergency Decree number 9 in May of 1975, which made it illegal for students to assemble, demonstrate, or engage in any political activity, organized on-campus resistance to Park regime buckled under the pressures of vicious crackdown. So with respect to musical activities of the students, these acts of protest straddled between non-conformity to conservative values and norms of mainstream society, and resistance to state authority. This was evident in their enthusiasm for songs and acts in trend associated with the global counterculture of the 1960s, which were mainly those of folk, rock, and gospel variety translated or adapted into Korean. In the 1970s, these songs were tied less to a culture of protest than they were expressive of the counterculture ethos of liberty and tolerance. When song clubs began to emerge on university campuses in the late 1970s, their main purpose was recreational for the most part. For many who joined, it was regarded as a venue for casual sing-along of their favorite folk songs, which included household names such as Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, and Kim Min-gi, the legendary folk singer in South Korea whose poetic song became the most widely sung anthem of resistance by virtue of its censorship by the Park Chung-hee regime. And for the more musically oriented students, song clubs such as Meari of Seoul National University were regarded as a practice session to enter the state-sponsored campus song festival aired on mainstream television. So setting aside the popularity of the song festival among the college students of the time, it might also be worth mentioning that it was also a festival that was designed by the regime as a way to rear in the dissident youth and keep them from getting into political activities. So such intermittent character of student protest and the pervasive air of youth resistance to conformity would shift to a more public and intentional form of resistance in the 1980s that is to the level of a movement. Triggered by the onset of another military dictatorship in 1979 and its massacre of civilians in Gwangju the following year, student resistance began to assume a more organized and collected form. And with the state's enactment of campus liberalization policy that removed the resident riot police from campus grounds, a kind of questionable move given that it was an attempt to control the dissident student activities, the students' locus of activism moved from underground circles to department student organizations, that is, to overground. So the movement energy among the students exploded. Assembling cross-campus organizations, student activists built a massive nationwide student network. No longer hidden underground, activism became the zeitgeist dominating the campus culture. As far as the students were concerned, the knowledge and truth of their times were to be acquired not in the classrooms, but in the open areas of campus grounds, exalted to the level of the Acropolis itself. And coincidentally, this large open square where all the students are gathered there in the photo, and that's the Seoul National University's campus grounds. And that's where many of their rallies took place, and that place is actually called Acropolis. So no longer having to concern themselves with confrontations with police and on-campus arrests, rallies with jam-packed students took place on a day-to-day basis. And as for the graduates, once they were released from investigation and imprisonment, they would go off campus and begin operating as part of professional resistance organizations. On campuses, classrooms were refashioned as extensions of the rallies. And in these classrooms, students would form seminars, what they call them, or reading circles to carry out informal discussion and debates. And many a time, these debates became incendiary, as can be seen here, where students are engaged in anti-American discourse, linking it to the maintenance of authoritarian regimes in Korea. The anti-American sentiments became much more prominent in the aftermath of the massacre in Gwangju in 1980, which many Koreans believed would have been impossible without America's passive consent. So crucial to nurturing this zeitgeist of protest was pedagogy, which students then referred to as RP, which is short for reproduction, a routinized and ritualized format wherein the incoming freshmen would be given manuals of ideology to read, such as these banned books of leftist inspirations shown here. The curricular modes of the pedagogy were encapsulated in these two phrases. One, 정세 분석, or what we might translate as analysis of the times, and 투쟁 방향, or vectors of struggle. It had become clear to the students that resistance was no longer sufficient. They had to take that resistance to the level of structure, network, and design, that is, to a movement. So in that transmission of a set repertoire, a powerful education happened through songs. In the already vibrant campus culture of singing together, be it in the song clubs, in the taverns dotting the campus counts, and during underground meetings where the huddled students incantated the rhetoric of the movement, songs became a key means of forming new social formations beyond the strictly verbal and visible. The radicalization and systemization of the student movement brought about the realization that the existing repertoire of songs from the 70s did not meet the critical urgency of their times. The move from resistance to revolution called forth the need for a new inventory of songs, as well as the need to write and create their own songs. This had brought about a decisive turning point in the creation and dissemination of protest music on campus. And it was during this time that campus song clubs such as Meari at Seoul National University underwent a kind of conscientization of their own. So in writing their songs, the songwriters drew from a diverse pool of musical inspirations spanning the spectrum from gospel and military march to Western modern folk and traditional Korean folk, the latter which is broadly referred to as minjung. The accompaniment was simple, acoustic guitars mostly, and the simplicity often made in deliberate contradistinction to another type of musical entity on campus, which was the band. Of the various styles and genres, the appropriation of traditional folk song style was something that emerged in the 1980s as the song movement practitioners began to proactively turn to indigenous sources such as locally derived minyo for forms of authenticity and lived reality, as can be seen in these songbooks issued in 1987 from Noreol, which is the song club at Korea University. You can see that in the titles here, all the different 타령s. Okay. So, 타령 is a popular subgenre of minyo that features repetitive phrases and rhythms. And as diverse as these styles were in the songbook, there was a sense of purposiveness to how these songs were brought together in a collection. One was that the song styles were born of and elicited the practice of communal singing, a key concept in folk music, which functioned as a means of expressing a shared set of beliefs and values. In the numerous categories of songs included in the songbook, it becomes evident that the music which possessed folk roots, whether in its traditionally folk instruments being passed down orally or otherwise dealing with folk-related matters thematically, was, by the height of the minjung-oriented movement, actively collected to be disseminated to an ever more youthful audience. After all, the prime audience of these songbooks were the incoming freshmen, who were deemed as ripe material for the process of RP. As a case in point, we see an entire category of songs devoted to the songs written by Kim Min-gi, the accidental troubadour of revolution, through whom the South Korean folk scene greeted a new phase, baptized with the dual influence of the American folk revival and the Korean poet of resistance Kim Ji-ha, who was very influential in reworking traditional oral genres such as pansori into genres of resistance in the 1970s. Kim Min-gi played an indispensable role in changing the trajectory of folk from romantic, directionless discontent with conservatism to socially conscious dissidence, as demonstrated by his songs that carry much minjung-song, or tendency to prioritize the popular and the people, as it were, such as the figure of the biracial child in post-Korean War camp towns featured in his song 종이연, or Paper Kite, and another song called Light from the Factory, written in 1978, where the figure of the female factory worker and their trials were brought to light through the song. Another logic for the songbook's collection, as stated in the preface of this songbook, the shared imperative that, quote, the life of a song lies in being sung in everyday life, end quote. At a more general level, this statement emphasizes the connection between song and daily life. But in the context of 1980s, what we're offered here is an instantiation of the reigning key word of the 1980s student movement, and by extension, the minjung cultural movement. And this key word was 현장성, which might be translated, however imperfectly, as a kind of a sense of there-ness or a sense of immediacy, or being there in the actual spot, moment, or scene. So few among the student activists of the 1980s would deny the centrality of, but also the very existential and epistemological dilemma brought on by 현장성 to the movement ethos of their time. Indeed, the manifestations of 현장성 were varied and divergent within the movement sphere. Perhaps, however, we might locate the most pronounced and deliberate manifestation of 현장성 embodied by the figure of 학축, which means a student turned worker whose very willingness to leave 기득권, or the sphere of privilege that comes with education and social background, and enter 운동권, which is a sphere of movement, which to the students at the time vested one with moral privilege. So given this context in which the movement was proliferating, it was all the more imperative that the songs forming that repertoire of action, especially if the action was happening at a 현장, a site that was not a factory, but an on-campus rally, that the songs be designed to transform everywhere one sings the song or hears the song into a 현장, into a site. The songs written and curated by the song clubs grew increasingly correlated to the specific imperatives of student activism. So looking through the 1984 songbook from Song Club 메아리 of Seoul National University, two keywords stand out: labor struggle and Gwangju. Not only are the songs fashioned as a call to arms, often bearing strong resemblance to the tune of the socialist anthem, the International, songs such as Workers Unite or May Advancing are peppered with maxims of revolution such as, quote, the burning spirit of democracy, end quote, and, quote, liberation of the people, unquote. The curatorial work of accompanying graphics, such as the depiction of a worker beating a traditional gong here, the woodcut aesthetics of which becomes a politicized artistic language in the 1980s, as well as the photo of the citizens' army in Gwangju engaged in a battle against state violence, and mottos such as Gwangju continues today, also demand further engagement with the very politics of representation operating in and between these songs. And in the heavily anti-American, anti-authoritarian context of the post-Gwangju 1980s, in which the category of minjung grew increasingly politicized, traditional Korean minyo and the work of excavating, creating, and disseminating those songs became an ever more urgent task. Indeed, embodiment of 현장성 also becomes an overriding concern among the practitioners and proponents of minyo as well. So here, I would like to discuss the last of the three paradigm shifts in the movement at large, and in the song movement as well, which had to do with the discourse of minjung transforming from a category of the oppressed to a privileged agent of history. Minjung, literally meaning the people or masses, represented a framework with which to reinterpret history through the lens of those who were politically oppressed and economically marginalized. In the context of the 1980s, the politically oppressed signified those killed during the Gwangju massacre in 1980, and economically marginalized, the workers. The radicalized climate of the 1980s generated an urgent need for the students to actively insert themselves into the process of re-articulating the minjung from their subaltern status to active revolutionary subjects. Song clubs and their songs were at the forefront of this radicalization. 메아리, the song club, used their regular concerts as prime vessels to disseminate and instill, to do the work of RP, it is, the ideals set forth by vanguard student organizations such as 삼민투, which is the committee of the three Min struggles, where the three Min stood for the tripartite goals set forth by the movement: 민족 통일, or ethno-nation to be unified; 민주 쟁취, democracy to be achieved. And the word 정치, connoting the act of possessing something through struggle, and 민중 해방, the people to be emancipated. In May of 1985, Sammintu took these slogans from the realm of on-campus rallies to off-campus acts of resistance. The resistance culminated in an event where over 70 students occupied the U.S. Cultural Service Building in downtown Seoul, demanding a formal U.S. apology for the massacre in Gwangju. So by the end of the 1980s, in the disenchanting aftermath of the transition to procedural democracy, where the seeming endurance of the status quo was witnessed, the student movement reached its height of intensification. As the student movement diverged into two factions, NL for National Liberation and PD for People's Democracy, songs again became the vehicle of pedagogy in this context of deepening cleavage. The songs were turned into very specific vectors of struggle and analysis of the times. With respect to the three men that I just mentioned, as can be gleaned from these two widely sung songs, one calling for the liberation of the working class, the March of the Korean Workers United, and the other one from Seoul to Pyongyang, yearning for reunification of the country, so national liberation. In other words, the songs underwent an active weaponization with key words and content that were reflective of each faction's design for a new society and a new nation. Weaponization did not necessarily mean, however, that all the songs became yoked to the regimental acoustics of a military march or battle hymn. By the late 1980s, there was a diversification of songs created within the movement in terms of its musical styles, as exemplified by this NL song from Seoul to Pyongyang, which I'll play briefly.
서울에서 평양까지 택시로도 2만 원 소령도 가고 달라도 가고 돈 가는 곳 없는데 광주보다 더 가까운 평양은 왜 못 가 우리 민족 우리의 땅 평양만 왜 못 가 경적을 울리며 서울에서 평양까지 꿈속에라도 신명나게 달려올란다.
So musically, the genre might fall under a popular genre, very popular today actually, called 뽕짝, which is kind of a Korean version, pop version of foxtrot, okay? Which is often considered highly commercial and even lowbrow by some. But this, just as a side, the song that I played from Seoul to Pyongyang, they mentioned a cab fare. The lyrics are actually written by a cab driver, okay? And because the song is still popular today, they have to update the cab fare because of inflation. So now, the last I heard, it was like 70,000 won. So these weaponized songs were strategically incorporated as integral components of student rallies. To imagine the generic setup of any given rally, one might think of a church service where there's an opening hymn that precedes the scripture, followed by the sermon, testimonies, and the Lord's Prayer, then the worship songs that relate to the sermon and a closing hymn. Similarly, at rallies, a song was deployed as a sonic signal to gather the students. This would be followed by the slogans of protest, the scripture, and speeches, the sermon, by activist leaders, and testimonies by recently joined activists. Then, given the theme of the rally, students would choose from any number of content-appropriate songs drawn from the song club's repertoire. The end of the on-campus rally, upon which the students would march to the main gates of the school, signaled the beginning of a street protest, the point at which the march would take the students beyond the Ivory Tower and into the wild, so to speak, where the collisions with the police would occur. Although those confronting the police were not able to keep singing, those that followed behind would continue singing the songs. Within this setup, the most militant of the songs were placed between the speeches and the closing song. Typically, rallies were bookended with the song "We Shall Not Be Moved," which I played at the beginning of this talk, placed at the beginning of the rally, and then by the end, Kim Min-gi's "Morning Dew," which was a hugely popular Korean folk number among the students at the time. So this was another organizational strategy, as these two songs were the most inclusive, given the diffuse character of their political address and recognizability among a diverse range of people. So what was behind the formidable speed at which the song movement proliferated? So what was behind the formidable speed at which the song movement proliferated in the late 1980s? Aside from the simple reason that rallies increased in their frequency and intensity, it may be helpful to think about the rally as a stage, where in the singing of the songs, the performance became meaningful action. By stage, I do not conceive of it simply as a stage where one can perform, but a place that makes the singing of those songs performative and hence political. In other words, it was the performance of the songs that enabled one to become an activist. Borrowing Diana Taylor's concept of a scenario, which she defines as, quote, a paradigmatic setup that relies on participants, is structured around the plot with an intended though adaptable end, end quote. We might argue that it is the scenario of the movement operating on that stage, the rally, which made the performance become a meaningful action. And in turn, the performance made the scenario of the rally alive and compelling. So it is thus no wonder that in the thick of the student activism, songs of the movement entertained immense popularity. Bolstered by this enthusiasm, the student singers took their performance of the songs to a different stage. Formed out of collaboration between the folk legend Kim Min-gi and lead members of Song Club Meari, the group named itself Nochasa, or People in Search of Songs, a moniker that was itself a testament to group's roots in an era that condemned such frivolities as entering the mainstream music scene, a time when crowd singing, or daechang, was much more of a prized virtue than virtuosity itself. In 1989, singing the hits from the song movement from their days in the song club, Nochasa would entertain a surge of popularity. Indeed, without a single appearance on mainstream television or radio, they would go so far as to rank top 3 in a pop-oriented TV music program called Kayo Top 10. Their popularity, however, was rather short-lived. The daunting speed at which the song movement proliferated and the equally fast manner in which the song movement became fossilized had to do with the disappearance of that stage, as well as the scenario that gave context to that stage. That proper stage was none other than student demonstration. 노차사, while it may have attempted to make the transition from action to performance, the songs and the movement specificity of their performance, the group singing, the modest casual trappings of their days as students, no longer bore meaning. The action to which their performance of the songs had been adhered and which had given their performance its vitality had become virtually absent in the fast liberalizing climate of the mid-1990s. The affect emerging from their performance, in other words, had become unactionable. But while Nochasa's experiment in the late 1980s and early 1990s fell short of retaining mainstream popularity, the series of struggles against social injustice in 21st century South Korea have proven once again that the relationship between protest and singing that defined the song movement of the 1980s is one that endures. To be sure, since the 1980s, that musical repertoire has undergone a dramatic shift in South Korea. So as a case in point, I would like to share an example from 2016 when students of Ewha Women's University engaged in a months-long protest against the university's plan to build a college of continuing education in spite of their opposition. The students' condemnation of what they perceived as the university's capitalistic venture brought to surface an admission scandal involving the daughter of Choi Soon-sil, who was former President Park Geun-hye's close friend and confidant. What began as a university's internal investigation led to the ouster of the university's president and went on to spark a parliamentary investigation of the so-called Choi Soon-sil Gate that would ultimately lead to the ouster of the country's president. So here's a footage of the students staging the protest on campus at the time. So those of you well-versed in K-pop may have recognized it. It's called 다시 만난 세계 or Into the New World, the debut single of the K-pop idol 소녀시대 or Girls' Generation. And since 2016, the song has been sung and heard in various and somewhat unexpected places, such as the impeachment rallies in South Korea the same year, during a women's march in New York, and during an anti-government rally in Bangkok, Thailand in 2020. So if such repurposing of songs proves anything, it may be that it's not just a song where the song originated from and for what purpose, but the very act of singing together that proves the most powerful means of bringing people to action. Thank you.
Okay, now I think we can open the floor for questions. I think we can just do a couple of questions from the floor first, and then move on to some Zoom questions, and then come back.
In the kind of manifesto of the students saying, we have real songs of our own, but we've been corrupted by the mass media. Was that like a word for propaganda, or did they just not like television?
So television actually in South Korea wasn't a household staple until the 1980s. But in terms of mass media, I think what they were also referring to there were the trends in commercialized popular music that were at the time very heavily influenced by the trends in America, in the US. And a lot of that obviously had to do with the kind of post-Korean War military occupation by American military, which still continues today. But the music that was streaming in through the radio network that was set up in Korea by Americans as form of entertainment for the U.S. Soldiers. And that's how these South Koreans started to, get wind of these trends. And actually, one of their, the most important stage for many South Korean pop singers at the time was actually the U.S. military base. So by mass media there, I think the kind of the deeper level of meaning, what they were actually referring to these non-Korean American trends that were seen many as a propaganda of American capitalism.
And now we think of North Korea as very oppressive. Do those students really want to go to North Korea?
Well, so that's a great question. Because of the very strong nature of anti-communism in South Korea, I would say up until the 1970s, there was, I think, some level of anti-communism even among the student protesters. But in the 1980s, and especially after this kind of overall sentiment of betrayal that South Korean students started to feel against the US government for having given that kind of consent to us, for the massacre of Koreans, there's this kind of active reversal of their loyalty, okay, I would say, from the America, because America up until the 1970s was seen as sort of the big brother of democracy, okay? And then feeling betrayed from that, they turned heavily inward, looking very, taking a kind of a nativist turn, okay? And in the process, also started to embody, discourse and ideology such as 주체 of North Korea as part of that sort of, term.
Just freedom.
Yeah, freedom. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'd like to ask you about the tradition of crowd singing,
Mhm.
if it exists in Korea. I can see that the act of a kind of large group singing together could be really a powerful, kind of passionate moment. Does this have a historical past in Korea, or is it something that just kind of emerged spontaneously in this movement in the 80s?
Well, yeah, no. So I do think there is an aesthetic to collective singing, and singing that's not, choral, because church choir singing that still requires, a strong level of meditation, practice, and skill, kind of a talent. But when it comes to group singing and collective singing on the, at these sites, the rallies, okay, it's much less the aesthetic value doesn't come from the fact that there's a kind of a virtuosity embedded there, writing there, but it's the fact that that's been discarded out the window. And it's actually the fact that they discard that, disavow that talent, the aesthetics, that crowd singing becomes that much more meaningful, right? And I have seen testimonies from earlier parts of 20th century, okay, where protests were occurring, where that group singing was going on, but because at the time Koreans felt that they had no protest music to turn to of their own. So they needed to pick these very simple melodies that can be adapted to many, different purposes. And one of the tunes that kept this tradition of crowd singing going was actually the melody to when Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. So they took that melody, okay, and then put in their own lyrics that would continuously change with each theme of that whatever specific moment that they were in. And they called it the hurrah song. But it would stop, obviously, in the 1980s once they start to turn to, local manifestation of folk.
Okay, I think we can do a couple of questions from the Zoom audience, and it's pretty long, so I'm just going to read it out loud. This is a question from Todd Henry. I really enjoyed your talk, especially the focus on music and lyrics. Thank you. My question is about we as scholars should consider these individuals who were differently oppressed during the 80s. You seem to accept at face value the view of students themselves, i.e. as oppressed vis-a-vis the authoritarian state and large corporations. But I wonder how college-educated students, indeed quite privileged actors at the time, might have worked, even in their own emancipatory movement, to marginalize other even more oppressed actors, both those within the movement, i.e. women, and the many others who either didn't have the socioeconomic background and or personal desire to participate in public activism, but also struggle in their own life spheres, i.e. queers. I know this is not your main interest for today's presentation, but what might you say about non-activist music and identities during this period?
Well, this is a very important point, and thank you, Todd, for raising this question. And I think, and here I think I can actually bring this question back to the point I was making about 현장성. Why this feeling of being there in the moment, and the very concept of 현장, which is a site. And 현장 for many students at the time didn't spell out to be the campus. It actually was the 현장, as in, factory, where laborers were working. And that's why, in order to embody the 현장성, many felt that they had to disavow their elite, their sense of elitism, by quitting school and going into factories themselves, by becoming workers and taking that opportunity to turn to more people more marginalized than themselves. And this is why this was continuously, for many students at the time, a kind of an existential dilemma, because they knew, and especially because in the 1980s, these students were also coming up against a lot of criticism, that how can you faithfully represent, the criticism went, the masses, if you're not one of the masses yourselves, if you're not truly marginalized, if you're not truly dispossessed as them. And many would, become very bothered, disturbed by that. But there were also that, just as many that kind of, felt that emboldened by the very fact that they were participating in this movement, which, to a large extent, was a kind of a campus culture. Okay? That being said, it's a criticism that in 1980s, in 21st century South Korea, still has to address the fact that, perhaps the limitation of the minjung movement, at the head of which, were students often, wasn't able to be executed successfully or fully. And it's precisely because in that call for collectivization, they had to either consciously or subconsciously disavow, the call for a real sort of a genuine notion of, a democracy, which is really looking at marginality and the state of being dispossessed from a much more diversified sense of the term.
Okay. Could we get some more questions from the audience? I mean, I do have one, but I'm just gonna wait my turn towards the end.
What are like the afterlives of minjung songs? Like I'm thinking. So I work on the Philippines, and the Philippines in a lot of ways has a similar protest culture from precisely the same period in the 1980s. And strangely, but also really interestingly, a lot of the songs, the protest music from the Marcos administration, at the same time as the Park administration, are like being repurposed now in other like more popular forms like diasporic hip hop and things like that. I'm just wondering, when this kind of song culture wanes in the 1990s, does it ever get picked up again in startling forms? Or when things do happen, we have the references to like K-pop songs in new contexts?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think in the broad sense, the very popular sense, the songs that were very hot during the 1980s, the minjung songs that the students, many of them wrote the lyrics and the music, and they of course performed it and recorded it themselves. They're still around, okay? But they're not being picked up so much. Whereas the songs that made a brilliant comeback and are being sung not just by protesters, but by others as well, who may not share the same political beliefs as the protesters, are actually the songs that were popular, okay, in the 80s, but began, they have their origins in an earlier time period, the 1970s, before things became very organized and purposive. So the fact that some songs make a comeback, they're able to make that comeback today, I think perhaps has to do with the fact that they weren't, politically focused. They weren't politically saturated from their origins. Whereas the songs that were deliberately produced for that very, for the moment of action, once that cause for action, the purpose is gone, where do the songs go? Protesters from way back then still sing them on their own, but when you see them singing them on their own, sometimes I do sense a kind of a underlying sense of almost an embarrassed retreat, more or less. But there are songs that still make that that resurface today, and very actively so, whereas others don't. And I find that sort of distinction very interesting, and how protest songs, the afterlife, as you said, of the protest music.
So there are no more questions. I'm going to jump in with mine. It's very closely related to Alden's question, and you did address it, in your answer. But I really like your emphasis on 현장성, the virtue of being there, and how that makes all this very powerful. So you mentioned that sometimes former protesters do sing this, but overall, how does that generation that was politically active, how do they remember these songs today? Do they engage with it in any ways beyond those fits of embarrassment?
Yeah. So so when I mentioned embarrassment, it's of course not something that's universal to
Right.
Shared by all. Okay, it's by some, by few, but they do have these performances, events, where if they're sung in rallies, these former protesters and former song movement practitioners gather and put together kind of a modest concerts here and every now and then, and there the songs are continuously heard. Now, some of these minjung songs, okay, still make, even the ones that were written in the 1980s and very heavily utilized in the protest scene, do still outlive their time, okay, and do make a very fabulous afterlife. And they have to do with the songs that have been performed by the movement practitioners that have their singers that have their origins in that movement, but have started to make their own individual leeway into the mainstream music scene. So as a key example, I'm drawing a blank here, but the guy who passed away very early in his age.
Yu Jae-han?
No, not Yu Jae-han.
Oh.
He's, but I went to Daegu and they had a whole museum.
김광석.
Kim Kwang-seok,
Yeah.
thank you. So one, case in point would be a folk singer whose popularity still reigned through the 1990s and well on to even after his very early death.
And oddly very popular in Germany apparently.
Yeah, so I heard.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna check the Zoom audience for, just in case I missed something, but, we do have one more question from Sean Han from Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for sharing this fascinating research with us. I agree that your study of activist and resistance songs in the 1980s is crucial for critical analysis of pop culture in South Korea. I'm thinking of this issue from the globalization of K-pop in the following era, in the 90s, which is often marked as the first wave of K-pop. In fact, many of the K-cultural industry giants were from 80s college students generation, such as Lee Soo-man, who found ESM Entertainment. But I wonder how we can reconceptualize the activist songs in the 1980s more critically against the backdrop of negative criticism made by those K-culture industry giants.
So the thing with music that we categorically identify to be K-pop today, I think from the get-go, I have very different beginnings, and I would say with different purpose. Because they're commercial songs, right? K-pop for the most part, engineered deliberately by these agencies. And of course, the artistry is definitely there, okay? But it's a commercial property, right? There's copyright to it and so on and so forth. Whereas the protest songs of the 1980s, the ones that I primarily look at, were not of that commercial purpose. I don't think we can, personally speaking, I don't think we can even think about the aesthetic or artistic merit of K-pop and the similar merit of the 1980s protest songs on a kind of an equal footing, okay? Because the intentions behind the production, I think, was very different. And so if you look at many of these, the protest songs like minjung kayo, okay, that are now retroactively being called minjung kayo, okay, a lot of them don't even, their lyricist is anonymous, okay, and sometimes even for the melody. Okay. And many songs from the 1980s, they borrowed the lyrics adapted from poets of resistance from the 1970s and 1980s. So I do think, it's not to say that minjung kayo doesn't have commercial value, but the purpose behind the creation, I think, was somewhat different.
Well, thank you all for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the talk as I did, and thank you everyone who joined from Zoom, even as far as from Jeju actually. So yeah, thank you so much, and please keep your eyes out for the next talks coming in this series. Thank you very much.